Andy Woodward wins third game in a row in today's fourth round of Tata Steel Chess Tournament, Wimbledon of Chess. And his opponent today was Dutch Grandmaster Max Warmerdam. Max, not too long ago, has been 2,700. I believe last year. Was it last year or a year before that? So it's kind of crazy to see he has dropped about 150 points since then. Maybe he stopped working on chess. Not sure what the reason for that is, but let's focus on Andy, okay? One thing that I'm particularly happy is to see Andy playing positional chess. Now, that is not his strongest suit. I would say he is a very sharp, dynamic player, but I definitely see this, I wouldn't say a switch, but improvement in positional aspect of the game. It's great to see, and let's break it down, how it went down in this game, and how he used his technique to squeeze out the small advantage out of nowhere. So game starts as d4, d5, c4, e6, queen's gambit declined, knight goes to f3. He doesn't go for his favorite Catalan opening, instead starts with knight f3, and Max plays a6, Janowski variation, or this is also known as Magnus's Queen's Gambit declined. There is a very nice free course on Chessable that I am going to be including actually in the description by Niels Grandelius, and he calls it Magnus Queen's Gambit declined, I believe. Bishop to g5, one of the main moves. Bishop goes to e7, bishop takes e7, queen takes e7. Actually, my bad. Probably taking on d5 is the main move, in fact. Black's idea of playing a6 is to take on c4 and then try to strengthen that with b5 and basically keep the pawn. If white was to play, let's say, g3. Bishop goes to g5, bishop goes to e7, bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, knight b d2. Now knight protects the c4 pawn, and after knight f6 we're back onto Catalan trails with the dark squared bishops traded off the board. Knight goes to c6, rook goes to c1. Both players seem to be in the prep still here. D takes c4, and bishop goes to g2. Bishop g2, there is no rush really to capture this pawn back, because after bishop g2, b5 is going to be impossible due to knight e5 and pin on the diagonal. So Max plays e5. Again, he's playing very fast here, meaning that he's still in his book. Knight takes e5, knight takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes e5. Bunch of pieces get traded in the center. I thought he was going to take knight takes c4 here, but he goes queen a4 check first. What's the idea of queen a4? A very provocative move, I would say. True to Andy style here. The point is, if black plays b5, then knight takes c4, attacking the queen. And now black has weakened their queen side quite a bit here. And this fork is not going to matter as much. Let's say if you go queen g5 here, simply queen back to c2, and you have to move the rook away, and then we'll move the knight away, and you have weaknesses on the queen side. So black plays queen to b5. Here's to block it. Now queen a3. Obviously black wants to castle, and white tries to stop black from castling with queen a3. Bishop goes to e6 and pawn to b3. Here we go. We are on a familiar territory, I think, for Andy here, always playing for the initiative, and does not mind sacrificing the pawn for it. Now, it's not really a sacrifice, though, because if you take on b3, there's going to be rook takes c7 with a lot of initiative, plus white will recoup the sacrificed material there, pawn or two. Black plays a5, which is the second best move. Apparently c3, rook takes c3, and long castle was the first line of the computer. A very interesting position. Now most likely we're going to have the opposite colored side castles here. I was thinking maybe like queen c1 to hit this pawn on d7, and when you play rook d7, maybe go short castle. Is there queen e2? Well, yes, there is, but knight c4 gives white quite a bit of an initiative here. With knight b6 coming up next, knight a5 also. So black played a5 instead themselves. Short castle, king has to castle, and black closes this diagonal with queen b4. Knight takes c4, short castle. I think it was Max's chance to trade queens, but he doesn't. So now Andy moves the queen away. Queen b2. Pawn goes to a4, and knight goes to e5. Let's talk a little bit about this position. Very standard, I would say, with Catalan positions when pawns get traded in the center, and we are left with pawn majority on the king side for white with this bishop, and pawn majority on the queen side for black. Which one is more valuable? Computer says it's literally 0-0s. So it's very balanced, but balanced does not mean a dead draw. Okay, position is equal, but there's still a lot of fight in the position. A takes b3, A takes b3, queen goes back to b6 because the c7 pawn was hanging there. Queen goes to c3 and rook a2. Probably I would think that something like c6 would make sense here, but rook a2 to go for the e2 pawn. Bishop f3. Pawn to c6, knight goes back to d3. Now, at the moment, this pawn is hanging, but queen takes b3, bishop takes b3, then either knight to c5 and winning the b7 pawn, or rook b1, and again, on the next move, white will win the b7 pawn. I do believe, though, that if that happened, let's say a knight c5 here, bishop d5, it's very likely that this game would end up in a draw. Let's say, even if you win both pawns here and a few pieces get traded, it's going to be very hard for white to win it. However, black does have to struggle a little, or have to make a few precise moves here, since the only side that can potentially win this is going to be white, right? So rook e8, knight goes to c5, bishop goes to g4, rook e1, bishop f3, e takes f3. And bishops were traded. White pawns have been doubled, but let's see if that is a weakness or a potential source of initiative. Pawn to h6, white plays pawn to h4, queen retreats back to c7, king g2. Now both sides are trying to consolidate here. Rook d8, queen to a1. An interesting spot for the queen there. b6, knight goes back to e5, knight d5. Now knight goes back to d2. I believe it is headed towards the c4 square, or is it just a provocation? Let's say, hoping that black would play knight f4 check, setting up a little trick here. If you take, then rook e8 check, queen b1, g6, and queen returns back to a1, and suddenly black king is in trouble here. Max does not fall for it, moves the knight back, knight c4, pawn to b4, a little bit of shuffling here. Now knight comes to e3, potentially f5, and once queen c8 is played, pawn to g4. Okay, now it kind of becomes clear, or the way the game was played out, white got the chance to try gain some counterplay on the queen side with the help of these double pawns, because now that keeps the king quite safe after a move like g4. Rook goes to e8, rook d1, queen goes to e6, knight lands on f5 here, and at last Max decides to trade queens to neutralize white's initiative on the king side here with queen to e5. Queen takes e5, rook takes e5, rook goes to d6. This initiative does not only happen when queens are off the board. With queens off the board, it is also going to be quite tricky to keep the pawns intact here. And one of them is going to go down, because if you play rook e6 takes knight e7 check, then knight takes c6, winning the pawn. And knight endgame actually works in a very similar fashion as pawn endgame. So white, I think, would have a reasonable chances of converting that. Black plays h5 instead. Rook takes c6, h takes g4, f takes g4, knight takes g4, and knight moves away to d6. Now this pawn on b6 is in trouble. Rook e2 apparently would be the best move here, and the point being that if you play king f3, there's going to be knight e5 check, winning the rook back, and most likely gonna end up in a draw. So rook e2 was definitely the best move here. Rook takes b6, and then probably take knight f2, then rook b2, and objectively this should still end up in a draw. Maybe knight moving back, and if this pawn pushes all the way, then try to sacrifice the knight and win, trade off the h pawn in return. And rook and knight versus rook is not going to be winning. So instead of rook e2 here, Max plays f5, which is a little bit of an inaccuracy, but not the mistake yet, because rook e2 was still a threat here, and he plays king g3. If rook e2 now, there's going to be f3, rook d5, rook takes b6, and there goes the pawn. Okay, now black is down a pawn. Apparently, if rook, I was trying to see why not f3, but apparently knight e3. What if we take here, then f4 check? We cannot take because of knight d5. If you go king h3, rook f2, and then f3 pawn is going to drop. Now this f4 pawn is going to become quite unpleasant, actually. So Max plays a relatively milder move, I would say, rook to d5, rook takes b6, and g6. This is probably the first big inaccuracy, because it simply gives up the pawn here. If rook d3 check, apparently there was king f4, so that was also bad. So what was the correct move here? Correct move was knight f6, threatening rook takes d6, and knight e4 check. Apparently we have to go back. If you go forward, there's going to be knight d7, and once you have to keep the rook on the 6th rank to defend this guy, and then rook takes d4, rook takes b4 on the next move. And on one side of the board, only a pawn is not going to be enough for the win. So pawn to g6, knight to c8, a little bit of an inaccuracy apparently on ND side here. Apparently f3 would have been a better move. Rook d3 check, king now goes to f4, king f7, king g5, moving right into the lion's den here with our king, putting the pressure on the g6 pawn. Knight takes f2, rook takes f6 check, and this was by far the critical mistake in the game. Instead of moving king to the e file, which was the correct move, apparently this was the correct move, king e8 here, king takes g6, then probably rook d4, and either with, yeah, I think white is going to try to push this pawn probably, but oh boy, king takes f5, rook b4. Is that going to be enough? Computer says no, but on the board with the practical play, this can be very tricky. Also, important factor is that Max has 3 minutes left on the clock. He plays king g7, allows rook g6 now with the check. King h7, rook goes to b6, and that is 2 pawns. Now this pawn is also gonna drop, and just like that, white is completely winning. The 2 pawns are going to be enough to convert this position. So let's see what were the final moves here. Knight moves back, rook d5, rook b8, and apparently rook d4 was the nail in the coffin for black, I would say. They would have some chances of putting up the resistance here, but white will probably get rid of this pin and then start pushing these pawns gradually. But rook d4 fastens the matters, because now knight g4 check, king cannot go forward, there is a checkmate. If king goes back to g7, rook b7 check, king f8, then h pawn gets going, knight f6, king g6, checkmate threats are there. So I think, disappointed with his play. Max resigned. Very nice technical win by Andy. Again, I'm very happy to see him getting out of his comfort zone, or maybe this is not really out of his comfort zone, but leaning into something that maybe he did not consider his strength a year ago or so. But that's what prodigies are about, right? Making progress in a record time. So we see different shade of Andy's game, which we love to see. All right. Let me know what you think of the tournament standings at the moment. I believe here, let's quickly take a look. Aydin Suleymanli is also having a very good tournament, 3.5 out of 4 games. And then 3 players, Mark Maurizi Andrea, former junior world champion, I think a few years ago, Andy Woodward, and Messi of chess, Faustino Oro, who also won his game and is playing without a loss so far, 2 draws and 2 wins. A lot of interesting matchups. Let's see what happens in round 5. After the rest day tomorrow, we're going to have Andy playing Vedant Panesar. And the leader, Aydin Suleymanli, is going to be playing with black colors against Max Warmerdam. Faustino is going to play Lu Miaoye. A lot of interesting matchups. This is probably going to be a match to see. All right. We'll see each other in the next one.